On October 17th, 1940, an Air Chief Marshal walked into a meeting at the Air Ministry in London. He had just won the most important air battle in history. He had saved his country from a Nazi invasion, and he walked into that room expecting to explain how he'd done it. If you're new here, hit subscribe. You won't want to miss the rest of this story. Instead, he walked into an ambush. The men sitting across from him had already made up their minds. The man who saved Britain was about to lose his job. By November, he was out. His name was Hugh Dowding. If you'd asked anyone in the British military establishment about Hugh Dowding in the early 1930s, they'd have called him capable, prickly, and thoroughly unremarkable. None of them saw what was coming. Dowding was born in 1882 in Moffat, a small Scottish town. His father ran a school, and nothing about his childhood hinted at a future war hero. He attended Winchester College, then the Royal Military Academy at Woolwich, and was commissioned into the Royal Garrison Artillery. For years afterward, he moved from posting to posting across the empire, Gibraltar, Ceylon, Hong Kong, India, serving with a mountain artillery battery and living the unremarkable life of a junior officer in peacetime. Then something shifted. Back in Britain, Dowding became captivated by flying machines. It was the early 1910s, when aviation was still a curiosity and military aircraft barely existed as an idea. He showed up at the Aero Club at Brooklands and asked to be taught to fly. He couldn't pay for lessons, so he asked for credit. They said yes. A mechanic taught him. After just 2 hours in the air, he had his flying certificate. 2 hours. That single detail tells you a lot about him. He didn't wait for permission. He didn't wait for money. He simply made it happen. When war broke out in 1914, Dowding joined the Royal Flying Corps, flying as a fighter pilot and later commanding No. 16 Squadron. He was a solid pilot, but what really distinguished him was his instinct for systems and organization. He was already imagining aircraft not as lone scouts or individual dogfighters, but as pieces of a coordinated defensive whole. That's also where the friction began. Dowding's personality didn't sit well with people. He was reserved, blunt, and socially stiff. His men nicknamed him Stuffy, partly for his apparent lack of humor, and partly because talking to him felt like being questioned by a detective. He clashed repeatedly with Hugh Trenchard, the man who would later be remembered as the father of the RAF. Trenchard believed in offensive air power, bombing campaigns, carrying the fight to the enemy. Dowding leaned cautious and analytical. The disagreement wasn't just about personality. It was philosophical, and it would shape British air strategy for the next 30 years. Trenchard had Dowding sent home during the war. He was promoted, but effectively sidelined, missing the remaining fighting in France, for an officer hungry for advancement that could have ended a career. But Dowding wasn't chasing advancement in the usual sense. He wasn't political. He wasn't a networker. He simply believed that doing the job well would eventually be its own reward, which, in hindsight, was either admirably brave or hopelessly naive. After the war, Dowding joined the newly formed Royal Air Force in 1918 and spent the following decade cycling through staff and command roles, including a stint in the Middle East, before slowly climbing the ranks back in Britain. In 1929, he made Air Vice Marshal. The year after, he joined the Air Council as Air Member for Supply and Research, a title that sounds like paperwork but turned out to be one of the most consequential jobs in military history. In that post, Dowding did two things that would ultimately save Britain. First, he pushed hard for advanced fighter aircraft. While most of the RAF's leadership was fixated on bombers, convinced the next war would be won through strategic bombing, Dowding championed fast, modern single-seat fighters, the Supermarine Spitfire and the Hawker Hurricane. Both planes exist because Dowding believed in them, fought to fund them, and shielded their development from budget axes. Without them, there is no Battle of Britain to win. Second, and arguably even more decisive, he bankrolled radar research. In the mid-1930s, a scientist named Robert Watson Watt showed that radio waves could be used to detect approaching aircraft. It was crude, unreliable technology, and most of the military establishment had no clue what to do with it. Dowding saw the potential right away. If you could spot enemy aircraft before they crossed the coast, you could scramble your own fighters in time to meet them. No need to keep planes circling constantly, burning fuel and wearing out pilots. You could wait, watch, and react. Dowding backed radar when almost nobody else in the British military took it seriously. He found the money, pushed for trials, and showed up at demonstrations. When a 1937 test at Bawdsey collapsed into chaos, ground controllers issuing conflicting orders while bombers sailed overhead unopposed, Dowding didn't blame the equipment. He identified the actual problem. Radar worked fine, but nobody had figured out how to get its information to the pilots who needed it in time. That insight led directly to what became known as the Dowding system. And here, the story stops being merely interesting and becomes extraordinary. In July 1936, Dowding took command of the newly created RAF Fighter Command, headquartered at Bentley Priory, a country estate north of London built above a bomb-proof underground operations room. From that bunker, over the next 4 years, he assembled the most sophisticated air defense network the world had ever seen. The Dowding system had 4 connected parts. First, a chain of coastal radar stations, the chain home network, that could spot aircraft massing over France, buying roughly 20 minutes of warning. Second, the Royal Observer Corps, volunteers who tracked planes once they crossed the coastline and moved beyond radar's reach. Third, operations rooms at Fighter Command headquarters and at each regional group, where all this information was gathered, sorted, and mapped on a giant plotting table. Fourth, a radio network that let controllers direct squadrons to precisely the right place, altitude, and moment. Stop and think about that. In the 1930s, no computers, no satellites, nothing resembling modern IT, Dowding built a real-time data fusion network. Thousands of miles of dedicated phone lines linked radar stations to filter rooms, operations rooms, and airfields. Women of the Women's Auxiliary Air Force pushed wooden markers across map tables to track incoming raids, while controllers watching from balconies above those tables made split-second calls on which squadrons to launch and where. The entire system ran on people, telephone cable, and an organizational design that converted raw signals into usable intelligence faster than anyone believed possible. By the summer of 1940, Britain had roughly 50 radar stations lining its eastern and southern coasts. The Dowding system was up, tested, and ready, about to be tested in ways nobody could have fully anticipated. Context matters here. Before the war, the RAF's leadership was practically evangelical about strategic bombing as the decisive weapon of the future. It was near religious doctrine among senior air marshals that bombers would always get through and that no fighter force could stop a determined bombing campaign. Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin had said as much in Parliament in the early 30s. The bomber will always get through, there is no defense. The prevailing logic held that the only counter to bombing was more bombing. Build enough bombers, and no enemy would dare strike first. Dowding rejected all of it. And in 1930s RAF culture, disputing bomber orthodoxy was like disputing gravity. Well, it simply wasn't done. But Dowding had built a system that proved the orthodoxy wrong. Fighters guided by radar and ground control could intercept bombers before they ever reached their targets. The entire strategic assumption that had governed British air planning for a decade was about to be put to the test, and Dowding was the only senior officer who had staked his career on the alternative. In May 1940, Germany invaded France and the Low Countries. The French army buckled faster than anyone expected, and the British Expeditionary Force was driven back toward Dunkirk. Winston Churchill, newly installed as Prime Minister, began pressing for more and more fighter squadrons to be sent across the Channel to prop up the collapsing Allied line. This put Dowding in an impossible spot. Every squadron sent to France meant one less squadron defending Britain, and Dowding could see, with almost eerie clarity, that France was finished. The numbers made it obvious. Loss rates were unsustainable. Feeding more fighters into the fight wouldn't rescue France. It would only gut Fighter Command. On May 15th, 1940, Dowding sat down with Churchill, Air Minister Archibald Sinclair, and Lord Beaverbrook, Minister of Aircraft Production. He laid out the arithmetic. Fighter Command had begun with 52 squadrons. It was now down to 36. At the current rate of loss in France, it would have nothing left within 2 weeks. Nothing. The meeting ended with the cabinet voting to send 4 more squadrons anyway. The next day, Churchill was in Paris meeting French Premier Paul Reynaud, who was begging for more air cover. Churchill phoned London asking for 6 additional fighter squadrons. That same day, May 16th, Dowding wrote the letter that would alter the course of the war. Addressed to the Undersecretary of State at the Air Ministry, it didn't mince words. He argued that a minimum reserve of home defense fighters had to be preserved, and that until that minimum was met, not one more fighter should cross the Channel. He warned that, if home defenses were bled dry trying to salvage France, the collapse of France would bring about, in his words, the final, complete, and irremediable defeat of this country. Nobody else in the British military establishment was saying that out loud. Nobody else was willing to look at the map and declare that France was already lost, and that pouring more fighters into that loss would cost everything. Dowding said it in writing, directly to people who didn't want to hear it, and it worked. Sinclair carried his argument to the cabinet. Churchill was furious, since the decision cut against what he wanted, but the cabinet agreed to cap further deployments. 6 additional squadrons could operate from French airfields by day, but had to return to Britain each night. 3 days later, Churchill scrapped the order altogether, and nearly every Hurricane squadron was pulled back to home bases. Dowding had saved Fighter Command. Churchill never quite forgave him for it. It looked like a minor bureaucratic decision at the time. It wasn't. It's the decision that made the Battle of Britain possible. When the Dunkirk evacuation began in late May, Dowding worked with Keith Park, commander of 11 Group, to provide fighter cover over the beaches. It was brutal work. With around 200 aircraft available, his pilots had to fly across the Channel, fight over Dunkirk, and fly home again. Soldiers on the beaches often couldn't see the RAF fighting overhead and cursed the Air Force for abandoning them. But Dowding's pilots were up there anyway, absorbing losses every day to keep the Luftwaffe from turning the evacuation into a slaughter. Over 9 days, Fighter Command flew more than 2,700 sorties above Dunkirk. They couldn't stop every bomb, but they prevented something far worse. By the time the last boats pulled away, more than 300,000 Allied troops had escaped. People called it a miracle. For Dowding, it was a grim preview of what was still to come. Pilots and planes he couldn't afford to lose spent defending an evacuation that never should have been necessary. Now came the real fight. The Battle of Britain itself ran from July through October 1940. The Luftwaffe hurled everything it had at southern England, wave after wave of bombers escorted by fighters streaming across the Channel. The goal was simple: destroy the Royal Air Force, seize control of the skies, and clear the way for Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of Britain. Dowding commanded roughly 3,000 pilots, about 80% British, the rest drawn from Commonwealth nations and émigré squadrons from Poland, Czechoslovakia, France, and Belgium. His own son, Derek, flew among them with 74 Squadron. And when Dowding called his pilots his chicks, it wasn't a figure of speech. He meant it literally. These were young men, many barely out of training, and he felt personally responsible for every one of them. His strategy matched exactly what you'd expect from the architect of the Dowding system. Cautious, deliberate, ruthlessly efficient. He didn't chase grand set-piece battles or throw every available fighter at every incoming raid. Instead, he trusted the system. Radar caught raids forming over France. Controllers tracked them across the Channel. Squadrons launched to intercept at the ideal moment when German fighters were running low on fuel and couldn't linger to protect their bombers. In early August, Ultra-Intelligence revealed the Luftwaffe was preparing Adlertag, Eagle Day, set for August 13th, meant to be the knockout blow that would wipe out Fighter Command on the ground and in the air. The Germans flew over 1,000 sorties against southern England that day, striking airfields, radar stations, and factories. But the Dowding system held. Controllers rerouted squadrons, damaged radar stations, came back online within hours, and fighters launched from backup airfields whenever primary bases were cratered. The Germans couldn't make sense of it. They kept pounding Fighter Command's airfields in southeastern England through late August and into September. Sector stations at Biggin Hill, Kenley, Hornchurch, and Manston took repeated hits, some badly damaged. Pilots flew 4 or 5 sorties a day, landing on fumes, grabbing something to eat, and going straight back up. The grind was relentless, and when his pilots wore down, Dowding rotated them out, pulling exhausted squadrons off the front line in the southeast and swapping in fresher units from quieter sectors. The German commanders, Albert Kesselring and Hugo Sperl, didn't bother with that. Their pilots flew until they broke. By September 1940, the pressure was nearly unbearable. On September 1st, Dowding realized there were no fresh squadrons left to rotate into 11 Group, which absorbed the heaviest fighting. He resorted to what he called a desperate expedient, splitting his forces into 3 tiers. A squadrons held the front line, B squadrons in the flanking group stood ready to relieve them, and C squadrons became training units, rushing new pilots into the pipeline as quickly as possible. Then, the Germans made their biggest mistake. On September 7th, the Luftwaffe shifted its attacks away from Fighter Command's airfields and onto London. The Blitz had begun. It was catastrophic for civilians, but a gift to Dowding. His battered airfields finally got time to recover, his worn-out pilots got a chance to rest, and the strain on Fighter Command's infrastructure, which had been nearing collapse, suddenly loosened. Then came September 15th, 1940. The Luftwaffe launched massive waves against London, and Fighter Command met every one of them with everything it had. The RAF downed roughly 56 German aircraft that day. A figure later revised, but the real impact was psychological. The ferocity of the British defense convinced Luftwaffe commanders that Fighter Command still had far deeper reserves than it actually did. They believed they were facing an air force that couldn't be broken. 2 days later, Hitler postponed Operation Sea Lion indefinitely. The invasion of Britain was off. Dowding had won. His system worked. His strategy worked. His careful handling of pilots and machines, his refusal to be baited into reckless fights, and his insistence on dictating the terms of engagement. All of it had been proven right. Fighter Command never achieved total command of the skies, and the bombing of Britain continued long after September. But the simple fact that the Luftwaffe never gained air superiority was enough. In strategic terms, it was Britain's most important victory of the war. So what happened to the man who made it possible? He was fired. Up to this point in the story, Dowding had been winning. That was about to change completely. The seeds of his downfall had been planted months earlier, growing out of a tactical dispute that had far more to do with politics and ego than with strategy. It's known as the Big Wing controversy. Here's the background. Fighter Command was split into regional groups. 11 Group, under Air Vice Marshal Keith Park, covered London and the southeast and took the brunt of the German assault. 12 Group, under Air Vice Marshal Trafford, Lee Mallory, covered the area north of the Thames. Dowding and Park were aligned. Send small, fast formations to break up incoming raids, hit hard, and pull out. Trust the system. Lee Mallory disagreed. He wanted to launch massive formations, big wings of 3 to 5 squadrons, to smash the German bombers with overwhelming force in a single strike. It sounded bold and decisive, and it had a champion in one of the RAF's most famous pilots, squadron leader Douglas Bader, a legless fighter ace with an outsized personality and direct access to Leigh Mallory. The trouble was that big wings took too long to assemble. By the time 30 or 60 fighters had formed up, German bombers had already dropped their loads and turned for home. Worse, while 12 Group was busy assembling its big wing, it was neglecting the job of covering 11 Group's airfields. Park's bases took bombing damage because Leigh Mallory wasn't providing the promised cover. Had that been the whole problem, Dowding might have weathered it. But then, Sholto Douglas got involved. Air Vice Marshal Sholto Douglas, Deputy Chief of Air Staff, worked from a desk at the Air Ministry, not a cockpit, and he'd been maneuvering against Dowding for years. Douglas backed the big wing theory, and he spotted an opportunity. A staff officer later recalled frequent phone calls between Leigh Mallory and Sholto Douglas throughout the battle, even though Leigh Mallory barely spoke to his own commander-in-chief. Douglas was quietly assembling a coalition. Leigh Mallory supplied the grievance, Bader supplied the credibility of a combat pilot, and Douglas supplied the political leverage inside the ministry. On October 17, 1940, a meeting was convened at the Air Ministry, officially to discuss fighter tactics and night defense. Chief of Air Staff Cyril Newall was meant to chair it, but fell ill at the last moment. Sholto Douglas took the chair instead. Dowding walked in, expecting to summarize the strategy behind the battle he'd just won. Instead, he found Douglas Bader seated among the air marshals, brought in supposedly so the ministry could hear from an actual fighting pilot. But Douglas hadn't invited any of the squadron leaders who disagreed with the big wing concept. Park's pilots, the ones who had actually done the heaviest fighting, weren't represented at all. The meeting turned into an ambush. Dowding was grilled over his tactics. Bader argued for big wings. Leigh Mallory backed him. Sholto Douglas, who was supposed to be a neutral chair, behaved more like a prosecutor. When the conversation shifted to night defense and Dowding pushed back on some of the ministry's proposals, it was treated as further proof that he was rigid and uncooperative. You'd expect someone to have objected. Nobody did. In November 1940, Dowding was removed from command and replaced by Sholto Douglas. Keith Park was also pulled from 11 Group and replaced by Leigh Mallory. The 2 men who had actually won the Battle of Britain were gone. The men who'd spent the battle arguing tactics from behind desks took their place. There was no honorary send-off, no public thanks from the government. Instead, Dowding was dispatched to the United States to study aircraft production, a role he was plainly unsuited for, and everyone knew it. It was a face-saving way to quietly push him out. He returned to Britain and was handed a review of RAF economy and organization, essentially a desk job, before finally retiring from the Royal Air Force in July 1942. And the men who replaced him? Sholto Douglas took over fighter command and immediately launched offensive sweeps across the Channel, operations codenamed Rhubarb and Circus, sending fighters over occupied France to bait the Luftwaffe into battle. They accomplished little strategically and cost fighter command more pilots than the entire Battle of Britain had. The aggressive tactics Douglas had once demanded from behind his desk turned out to be exactly the wasteful, reckless approach Dowding had spent his career trying to avoid. In 1943, Dowding was made a baron, Baron Dowding of Bentley Priory, named for the headquarters where he'd directed the battle, but he was deliberately passed over for promotion to Marshal of the Royal Air Force, the service's highest rank. The official explanation was that only former chiefs of air staff received that rank, a rule conveniently ignored after the war, when both Sholto Douglas and Bomber Harris were promoted to Marshal, despite neither ever having served as Chief of Air Staff. Churchill, whose government Dowding had saved, barely mentioned him in the second volume of his war memoirs. In the few places Dowding did appear, Churchill got the facts wrong, writing that Dowding had claimed he could defend Britain with 25 squadrons, when in reality Dowding had warned Churchill about the grave risk of defending the country with just 36. It reads like a deliberate attempt to shrink the man who had told Churchill things he didn't want to hear. Dowding spent his later years on pursuits that would have struck his former colleagues as strange. He grew deeply interested in spiritualism and theosophy, claiming to have communicated with the spirits of pilots who died under his command. He campaigned against animal cruelty and vivisection. The same rigid, awkward Air Chief Marshal, who had built the most advanced air defense system on Earth, spent his retirement attending seances and writing letters about animal welfare. That strange final chapter is part of what makes him so compelling. The mind that spotted the communication flaw in a failed radar test and built the Dowding system out of nothing was the same mind that came to believe it could speak with ghosts. You can read that as decline, or you can read it as the response of a man who had carried the weight of 3,000 young lives on his shoulders, watched his pilots die for months on end, and needed to believe their deaths meant something beyond tactics. Looking back, Dowding knew he'd been right, about the fighters, about radar, about France, and about his whole strategy, and he'd been punished for every correct call he made. He died on February 15th, 1970, at his home in Tunbridge Wells, at the age of 87. He's buried in Westminster Abbey beneath the Battle of Britain Memorial window. His son, Derek, one of the chicks who'd flown under his command, succeeded him as Baron Dowding. In the end, history has granted Hugh Dowding what the RAF wouldn't give him in his lifetime: credit. His system, his strategy, and his stubborn refusal to waste his fighters in a losing cause across the Channel are now recognized as the reasons Britain survived 1940. No Dowding, no Spitfire, no Hurricane, no radar chain, no integrated defense network. No system. And fighter command fights blind. No fighter command. And Hitler's invasion barges cross an undefended channel. The man they called Stuffy, awkward, humorless, difficult, the last person anyone wanted at their dinner table, turned out to be the only man in the British military establishment who saw clearly what was coming and got ready for it. He built the shield that saved his country. Then his country discarded him. In a farewell message to his pilots after losing his command, he wrote that he wished he could express everything in his heart, but couldn't hope to match the simple eloquence of Churchill's line about how never had so much been owed by so many to so few. Then he added quietly that the debt remained and would only grow. He was right about that too.